As I'm writing this, in January 2020, the world-breaking effects of climate change, forewarned by experts since the 1960s, have become everyday news. NASA's 2020 climate report is telling us we just finished the hottest decade on record. Australia recently lost dozens of human lives, thousands of homes, and more than 1 billion wild animals to an abnormally long fire season. Houston and Puerto Rico are still recovering from 2 once-in-a-century hurricanes we saw in the year 2017. And with Donald Trump in the White House, none of the policy surrounding this is getting better anytime soon. So is our situation hopeless? Are we doomed to extinction? Is there anything I, an individual, can do? In 2016, I asked myself these questions and started researching. After examining as much data as my brain could withstand on how to improve my environmental impact, I determined the most effective action I could afford was, drumroll, to go vegan. So I did. I gave up animal products on September 22nd, 2016, and haven't regretted that choice since. But was it rational? Does the scientific literature support that decision? Has any of it made a difference? I'm John Carmack, and in today's Vegify video, I'll explain why I'm vegan for the climate. Before we begin, I'd like to address a few common objections to veganism. This list of ubiquitous counter-arguments is not exhaustive, but it covers most of what I see in a given day on the timeline. First, not everyone can go vegan. I know this. I acknowledge this. I'm not pushing against it. It's a very real and basic fact of reality. Limitations such as poverty, food deserts, eating disorders mean not everyone has the ability to make food choices. Others have healthcare providers who are unwilling to encourage a patient towards a plant-based diet, either because of a dearth of nutritional education on the doctor's part, or a legitimate health issue on the patient's, or a combination of both. Adopting a vegan diet can require a dietitian if you're in this situation, and that's a huge cost barrier. So for all intents and purposes, people like this don't have food choices. So for those inhibited by geography, economics, and biology, our primary focus should not be insisting on compliance with veganism, but rather improving access to high-quality vegan fare. With delicious, low-cost vegan options available, reduction of animal product consumption will happen almost by default. This is already happening with the sudden boom in vegan products in restaurants lately. Nothing makes me happier than when my friends tell me they had an Impossible Whopper or they tried that vegan sushi place that just opened up down the road. Literally the best news a guy like me can hope for. And even more good news for us vegans, we encourage innovation and competition among vegan products by exhibiting demand for them. In other words, we just keep eating. The more units a brand like Gardein or Morningstar sells at Target, the greater their incentive to compete at Dollar General. The rare benefit of capitalism. And if you're wondering what's already available to plant-based eaters at these stores, head over to Vegan Zombie's channel. He's got some great videos on exactly that. But for those who do have food choices and therefore can choose a plant-based lifestyle, I'm talking to you, to us. In this video, I hope I can impress upon you 3 important concepts: the impact of our choices, the power that gives us as individuals, and the urgency of the task at hand. Which brings us to part 1, human contributions to environmental harm. I'm willing to bet most of the people watching this video already know about and accept the reality of human-caused global warming. Yale's long-running Six Americas study found in November 2019 that as many as 73% of Americans accept on some level that humans are causing climate change. But just in case you're one of the disengaged 7%, or the doubtful 10%, or you're one of the credulous 73%, and you just need a refresher, let's do a quick summary of the science to bring you up to speed. The atmosphere of planet Earth is comprised of a delicate balance of gases. This ghostly bubble of fumes maintains the conditions which have kept this planet inhabitable by humans for millennia. Certain gases in the atmosphere, such as water vapor and carbon dioxide, slow down the rate at which our planet loses heat. This rate of heat loss is different for every gas. The effect of this absorption and radiation was first described by American physicist Eunice Newton-Foote in her 1856 paper, Circumstances Affecting the Heat of the Sun's Rays. Fun fact, Mrs. Newton-Foote was the daughter of renowned scientist and mathematician Isaac Newton. For her experiment, Newton-Foote isolated the component gases that make up the atmosphere, then exposed them to the sun's rays, both in sunlight and in the shade. Measuring their change in temperatures, she inferred that carbon dioxide and water vapor absorbed and retained sufficient heat to affect climate, thus being the first to describe what we now call the greenhouse effect. This effect would be proven formally by John Tyndall in the year 1861, just 5 years after Eunice's paper was presented. This was all more than a century and a half ago, and incidentally is around the same time we began tracking temperature worldwide using thermometers. So we have pretty accurate temperature readings starting right at this point in history. We also have the glacier record telling us parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back much further than that. For example, this data set going back to 1000 AD. So with the advent of industrialization and the fossil fuel burning machines that came with it, not to mention the increasing size of the human population, which contributes to the greenhouse effect through land use, the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere began to climb. Despite the vastness of the atmosphere and the relative smallness of our species, we were able to alter our air's chemical makeup when we began burning fossil fuels for energy. First, we just used coal. Then we added natural gas. Then there was oil in there too. Every breakthrough we made in the field of internal combustion increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Every train, every tractor, every Model T, every hot shower. If it came from fossil fuels, it wound up in the atmosphere, and for a long time, nobody noticed. Some 80 years later, in the 1930s, it was discovered that the United States and North Atlantic region had warmed significantly over the previous half century. In 1938, amateur scientist Guy Stewart Callender, already aware of the greenhouse effect thanks to scientists like Tyndall and Newton Foote, estimated that humans had pumped 150 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and went on to hypothesize this was causing a greenhouse warming effect. And again, no one noticed. Callender's theory didn't receive much attention until the 1950s, when the United States government invested heavily in researching these temperature changes, as well as geologic processes in general, hoping the information might give them an edge in the Cold War. In 1960, painstaking measurements taken by Charles Keeling showed that CO2 in the atmosphere had, in fact, been steadily rising year by year. This, combined with the rising average temperatures and Callender's theory of global warming, told the United States government one thing: it was finally time to act. Only joking, of course. No one did anything. Over the next few decades, the temperature continued to rise. Publishing climate scientists continued to warn us, and as heat records got broken year after year, consensus among scientists built on itself, and eventually...
Apocalyptic images coming out of Australia right now.
Under normal circumstances, I would be waist height in water here.
Makes you want to cry to see the whole lake dry.
There isn't less rain. It's just coming in shorter, more intense, and unpredictable bursts.
Disaster. But still no action. Not enough. Nowhere near what was needed. To get where we need to go, a drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors is needed. If we don't get it, sea levels will rise, continents will burn, and humanity's tenure on planet Earth could come to an end. So with the enormity of the task in front of us, a reasonable person might ask, what can I do to help? Where can I put my energy? How much can I do, and how soon can I start? Which brings us to part 2. Examining our society's impact on the planet, we see the food system is the largest direct contributor to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. This is according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2014 estimates. And a large portion of this is unavoidable. We have to keep the population fed, or what's the point of any of this? We're not eco-fascist here at Vegify. In the future, I want to build there's room for everybody, and that means we have to make better decisions. Together. As a quick metaphor, when someone is trying to lose weight, the first thing they do is cut empty calories like sweets and chips. A society working to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions should look at its economic sectors in exactly the same way. What parts can be removed without compromising the benefit of the whole? And oh my God, is animal agriculture the beef-flavored cupcake in humanity's greenhouse gas diet? Raising animals for food provides humans with 18% of the calories we consume, but uses around 83% of our farmland, and is responsible for about 57% of total emissions. Not a great return on investment, to borrow a term from capitalism. If I'm giving the project 83% of my capital, I'd expect its output to provide for more than 18% of my needs. And if you're thinking we need those animals for protein, be sure to subscribe so I can address that more fully in part 2 of this series. But in brief, vegans get their protein from the same place most people get most of theirs. Plants provide human beings with around 63% of the protein we consume. Animals only provide 37%. Arguments against the nutritional adequacy of veganism come up fairly frequently, and again, I'll address those in part 2, but for now, I'll direct you to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position paper on vegetarian diets and be on my way. This video is not about the health benefits of veganism. It's about the environment. So moving on. When we look at this June 2018 article from Science that has been cited more than 330 times in the 18 months since it was published, we're given a more comprehensive view of the effect producers have on the environment and how consumer demand influences those producers and what that means for our responsibility as individuals. In this paper, we see that the worst offenders in animal agriculture could optimize their processes as much as they want, and they should, because the worst polluters in the beef industry are harming the environment at a rate 12 to 50 times greater than the average. But even with every animal farm producing at its most ecologically friendly version of itself, the damage caused by their production exceeds that caused by their vegetable substitutes. This means every animal product causes greater emissions, greater deforestation, fewer grams of protein per pound of CO2, more emissions from processing because slaughterhouse emissions alone outstrip any competing plant product, and ultimately, because animal products spoil more quickly than plants, they're more frequently wasted. So in those cases, all those resources were spent and all that environmental damage was done for no benefit or utility whatsoever. But even though producers are causing these emissions, they're doing so to meet consumer demand. If they're ever going to change what they're doing, it'll be because we, the people, stood up and told them that we would only make purchases that align with our goals. And as consumers, it's hard to know which beef producers are the mild offenders and which ones are doing 50 times the damage. It's all the same plastic-wrapped meat slab at the grocery store. They don't come with emission stickers. They should, but they don't. And so as consumers, we can deliver environmental benefits on a scale not achievable by producers by eliminating demand for these wasteful animal products from our way of life. Doing this, we reduce our personal food-related emissions by as much as 87%. Now, critics of plant-based living will sometimes offer the food miles criticism, the idea that buying local foods is more important than buying low-impact food. This is misguided at best. Yes, you should buy local and also try to avoid foods that have been air freighted. But in every case, food transit has a much smaller impact on the environment than food production itself. In the case of high impact foods like beef or lamb, the transportation footprint amounts to less than 1% of the total impact. You'd have to drive your macadamia nuts around the world several times before they approached the carbon footprint of a single slab of beef. The food miles argument is a non-starter. And so many can look at this information and say, well, that's out then. Meat, eggs, dairy, I can do without. But for many, myself included, it's not so straightforward. I learned about the carbon footprint of animal agriculture in 2008 as an undergraduate at Baylor University. And I didn't go vegan until 2016. I knew about this problem for 8 years before I got motivated to move on it, and I'll regret that more with every passing disaster. But I can understand there are significant hurdles one may have to overcome before feeling comfortable pledging themselves to a plant-based lifestyle, not least of which being the question, does it even make a difference if just one person goes vegan? Beyond my personal 87% reduction in food-related emissions, aren't corporations just going to keep polluting to meet the demands of everyone else? Which brings us to part 3. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge there are those who believe thinking we can do something about climate change on an individual level is anywhere from optimistic to laughable. After all, who cares if I give up meat? There's rich people out there doing more damage than I could ever hope to repair. One flight across the Atlantic undoes 2 years of veganism. Everybody else is eating meat. The real problem, they say, is the wealthy. Who am I, singular me, to fight back against a worldwide system doing all this damage? But the fact is, no individual fighting climate change is acting alone. Yes, we're just people, but together we're a movement. And the vegan movement has made an impact. Let me show you, using plant milks as an example. In 2017, cow's milk consumption in the United States continued the downward slide it's been on since the 1970s, a trend that continues to this day. At the same time, plant milk sales have skyrocketed, reaching new highs every year and showing no signs of slowing down. So if we multiply the gallons sold in 2017 by the carbon footprint per gallon, we can make an estimate of the carbon footprint for cow's milk that year in the United States. And here's the carbon footprint for all the plant milks. Now, it's true that cow's milk still takes the lion's share of sales, but what you don't see here is the effect plant milk sales had on emissions from the dairy sector. Let's say there were no such thing as plant milk, and everybody had to buy cow's milk. What would the carbon footprint of America's milk consumption be then? 2.19 million tons higher. That's a 4% reduction in greenhouse gases from one category, just by reaching a few inches to the side at the grocery store. And a common criticism you'll see on Twitter is, but almond milk is terrible for the environment, so vegans are wrong. Well, no, dairy eclipses almonds on all fronts. Here is America's milk carbon footprint from just cow's milk in 2017. Here's what it would have been if we only drank almond milk. Here's land use. Here's water use. The thirstiest almonds in the world can't begin to compete with the driest cows. And milk isn't the only sector vegans are making a difference. Between 2014 and 2017, the United States saw a 600% increase in those self-identifying as vegans, from 1 to 6% of consumers. That's about 19 million prospective customers looking at Beyond Burgers instead of beef, 19 million potential stands for Gardein. And that's just the vegans. According to a report from the NPD group in October 2019, 90% of the people buying plant-based substitutes aren't even vegan. They're just regular old people checking out the food. And every time they do, the environment benefits compared to if they had bought an animal product. So keep it up, vegans. Keep it up, vegetarians, reducitarians. You're doing great work. The world needs you. Even in editorials with inflammatory titles like this one of the authors, who is a publishing climate scientist, used the body to clarify that veganism alone won't save the planet, but is still very much an action worth taking. Poor guy had to clarify this point a bunch of times on Twitter, so I have to assume he ended up regretting that headline a little bit. Or maybe not, I don't know. Either way, Michael, man, thank you for clarifying. You occupy a position of influence, and I agree with you. Veganism is worth doing for the sake of the planet. I do want to emphasize, though, the thrust of his piece is very important, and it comes from a recently published study showing that when people take an interest in personal action to fight climate change, it can decrease interest in collective action. And that would be disastrous for the planet. So let me be perfectly clear. Being vegan is not enough to save the planet. Being vegan will reduce your personal footprint significantly and affect your community immeasurably, but it will not save the planet. We need to curb the consumption habits of the rich and completely overhaul how we let companies do business on this planet. We need to vote for politicians who will enact change. Once they're elected, we need to lobby them to enact that change. Make no mistake, environmentalists and economists agree. A carbon tax could do more for the planet than the whole vegan movement combined. So let's do both. In fact, we must do both because we've passed the point of irrevocable damage already. We're doing damage control now. We're working to keep the temperature from going up more than 1.5 degrees Celsius more than it already has. And we're failing. In case you've forgotten, the planet isn't just heating up anymore. It's on fire. Earlier, I showed you a graph correlating the atmospheric CO2 with annual carbon emissions. That comparison undersells the urgency of what we're dealing with by a lot. So let me correct the visuals here a bit. That's better. So what I didn't account for in the original graph was annual emissions are not the same as atmospheric CO2. Annual emissions are the greenhouse gases we have control over in the present day, but greenhouse gases don't work their way out of the atmosphere at the same rate we burn them. They work their way out at whatever rate they damn well please, and it's different for every gas. Methane has an atmospheric lifetime of 12 years. Nitrous oxides is 114 years. The atmospheric lifetime of carbon dioxide is between 50 and 200 years. So the more we burn today, the more we add to what's been there since the Industrial Revolution, and the longer it will be before our descendants see relief, and the less like our present their future becomes. Every bit of consumption beyond what's necessary is a debt we owe to a person yet to come, someone who is very much like ourselves. And at this point, for them, the best we can do is reduce the damage that's coming and work to repair the harm that we've already done. And that's why I'm vegan for the climate. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found what I've said in this video to be informative and motivating. If you did, be sure to hit the thumbs up button so YouTube knows this content is worth elevating. If you think others might benefit from this message, please share it on social media. It could make a big difference. If you'd like to see more content like this, including parts 2 and 3 of this series, where I'll do my best to describe the health benefits and ethical considerations of veganism, be sure to subscribe. And if you'd like to help us make more videos in the future, definitely check us out on Patreon. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.